The emperor falls asleep on your sleeve. He needs to leave. He cuts the sleeve off the imperial robe rather than wake you, walks out of the chamber barefoot, and the entire Han court spends the next morning trying to figure out which of you he is in love with this week. The robe ends up in the imperial wardrobe with a hole in it. The hole becomes a vocabulary word. 2,000 years later in modern Chinese, the cut sleeve is still the polite literary term for two men in a relationship. You are the man on the other end of that sleeve. Today you find out exactly what your job description looked like, what it paid, and how, in a kingdom of millions, you ended up sleeping in a corner of the most powerful bedroom on earth. The job has more than one name. Classical Chinese has a small library of euphemisms for what you are. The bitten peach, the cut sleeve, the fashion of Long Yang, the shared bed, the spring of Anli. Each of these phrases comes from a specific named historical incident. Each one ends in someone falling out of favor and dying badly, but the phrasing stays in the language and gets recycled by poets for the next 20 centuries. Chinese culture has been documenting your job description, with footnotes, since roughly the 6th century BC. The technical term for the institution itself is bxing, often translated as favored minions, which is what the imperial historians call you when they want to be slightly disapproving. The men of the Beijing are listed in dedicated chapters of the official histories. Sima Qian, the historian who got castrated for defending a general in 99 BC and then wrote the Records of the Grand Historian to spite the world, included an entire section called the Lives of the Favorites. Ban Gu, who finished the Book of Han a century later, included his own version. These are official imperial documents. Every literate official in China for 2,000 years had access to a paragraph that described, by name, the men who had been the favorites of the previous dynasty's emperors. Your job is, in administrative terms, weirdly well documented. The emperors had wives. They had official concubines, sometimes hundreds of them, organized into ranks with formal titles. They also had you, and the texts use a different vocabulary for you on purpose. You are not a concubine in the legal sense, because legal concubines could produce heirs. You are a favorite. Your category is different and your power is different. You sit somewhere between trusted personal staff and unofficial spouse, and the position is unstable in a very specific way that we will come back to repeatedly. Mizi Xia bites a peach. The language never recovers. Sometime in the early 5th century BC, a young man named Mizi Xia was the favorite of Duke Ling, who ruled the small state of Wei during the spring and autumn period. The story is preserved in the Han Feizi, a collection of legalist essays from about 300 BC. It exists because the philosopher Han Fei wanted to use it to make a point about how royal favor is fundamentally arbitrary, but the story keeps getting cited for 2,000 years for a different reason. One day, Mizi Xia heard that his mother was sick. He took one of the duke's chariots without asking, which was technically a capital offense, and rushed to her. When the duke heard about it, he praised Mizi Xia for being so filial that he risked execution to see his mother. Another day, the two of them were walking in the orchard. Mizi Xia bit into a peach, found it especially good, and handed the rest to the duke, who was charmed. "He has saved me the best of it," said the duke. "He could have eaten it himself." Then Mizi Xia got older, his looks faded, the affection cooled, and the same duke who had praised him for the chariot now had him executed for the chariot. The same duke who had been charmed by the half-eaten peach now cited the half-eaten peach as evidence that Mizi Xia had insulted him. Han Fei's lesson is that the facts of the case never changed, only the duke's mood did. From that day forward, the bitten peach is the standard Chinese literary phrase for a man whose lover lost interest. It is in poems, it is in opera. It is in the title of the earliest surviving Chinese essay, specifically about same-sex love, the poetical essay on the supreme joy, by Bo Xingjian, written around 800 AD. This is the part of the job nobody likes to think about. The favorite stops being the favorite. The story continues without you. You were trusted with the chariot. Then you were executed for taking the chariot. The two facts are not contradictions in court logic. They are the same fact at different temperatures. There is one other founding story you need before we leave this period, because the phrase that comes out of it shows up in Chinese poetry for the next 20 centuries. The man's name was Long Yang Jun, the Lord of Long Yang, and he was the favorite of King Angxi of Wei, somewhere around the late 4th century BC, during the Warring States period. The story is in the Strategies of the Warring States, a Han-era anthology of political anecdotes. The two of them are out fishing on a lake, says the anthology. Long Yang Jun catches more than 10 fish in a row, and partway through, he starts crying. The king asks why. Long Yang Jun says he caught the first fish and was delighted. Then he caught a bigger fish and immediately wanted to throw the first one away. "Right now," he says, "I am like that first fish. You favor me, but there are men in this kingdom more beautiful than I am. The moment one of them comes to your court, I will be the small fish at the bottom of the basket, and I will be discarded." The king, charmed and probably alarmed in equal measure, immediately issued a proclamation that anyone who recommended a more beautiful courtier than Long Yangjun would be executed along with their entire family. This is the story that gives Chinese the phrase, the fashion of Long Yang, another standing literary euphemism for a man with a male lover. It is also one of the better worked-out summaries of the structural problem of the favorite's job. Your position is not yours. You are competing, every day, with whichever beautiful young man has not yet walked into court. The trick that worked for Long Yangjun, which was to weep at the moment of maximum favor and preemptively warn the king about the next favorite, is genuinely shrewd court politics. It is also the reason the Lord of Longyang lived a long and quiet life, while most of the other named favorites in this list died young. The Han dynasty counts the score. Now jump forward 3 centuries and head to the Han dynasty, which is the period when this whole institution gets its golden age. The historian Brett Hinch, in his 1990 book Passions of the Cut Sleeve, walked through the records of the Grand Historian and the Book of Han and counted up which Han emperors had a named, documented male favorite. The number is 10. Out of the first 13 emperors of the Han dynasty, 10 of them have at least one named male lover preserved in the official record. Some have several. This is not a fringe statistic. The first 2 centuries of Imperial China, the period that gave Chinese civilization its first real bureaucratic state, its first census, its first standardized writing system, and its first really workable tax code, were also a period in which roughly 77% of the rulers slept with men, and nobody seemed especially confused about it. Han China was straightforwardly bisexual at the elite level, and the historians of Han China just wrote it down. The reasons the institution made sense, court-side, are similar to the reasons every pre-modern monarchy ended up with court favorites of one shape or another. A male favorite, much in the same logic that applied to court eunuchs, could not produce a legitimate heir. He could not found a dynasty that would compete with the emperors. He could be elevated, rewarded, given lands, given titles, and the worst-case scenario was that, when the emperor died, you got demoted, executed, or quietly retired. Whereas, if you were a male relative who had become the emperor's right hand, you might decide that you should be the emperor and start a civil war. The favorite was, structurally, the safer option. Han Yan goes hunting. The earliest celebrity Han favorite is Han Yan, the childhood study companion of Emperor Wu. Emperor Wu reigned from 141 to 87 BC, ruled longer than almost any Han emperor, conquered northern Vietnam, defeated the Xiongnu in Central Asia, founded the Imperial Academy, and personally selected most of the early entries in the records of the Grand Historian. He is one of the great expansionist figures of ancient world history, and he had several documented male lovers across his very long reign. Han Yan is the most prominent. The two of them learned to write characters on the same desk when they were boys. When the emperor took the throne at 16, Han Yan was made commandant of the cavalry. He rode with the emperor on every hunting trip. He slept in the imperial chamber. The emperor showered him with gifts and titles and gave him the same level of formal access he gave the chief minister. Sima Qian, who was a contemporary writing all of this down, mentions that Han Yan amassed wealth equivalent to a senior royal prince's household, which is a polite way of saying the boy who once shared a writing desk now owned half a province. Han Yan was a successful favorite for almost 2 decades. He was also, eventually, executed. The cause was a political scandal involving an alleged liaison with one of the Empress Dowager's ladies-in-waiting. The Empress Dowager, Han Yan's grandmother by political adoption, took the accusation as a personal insult to her household and ordered him to take poison. The emperor, who had to choose between his lover and his grandmother in front of the whole court, chose his grandmother. Han Yan died with the imperial favor formally on his head, a gold seal in his belt, and a cup of mercury in his hand. Dong Xian and the sleeve in the Sunday. The most famous favorite in Chinese history is Dong Xian, and his story is so widely cited that, 2,000 years later, his name is still the punchline of an idiom every Chinese-speaking person on earth would recognize. Dong Xian was a low-ranking official at the court of Emperor Ai of Han, who took the throne in 7 BC at the age of about 20. The emperor noticed Dong Xian for the first time when Dong was working as a court attendant, holding the timekeeping cylinder during a palace procession. Within months, Dong was promoted to the Imperial Guard. Within 2 years, he was a marquis. Within 4 years, in 1 BC, the emperor made him commander-in-chief of the Han armed forces, which made him, on paper, the second most powerful person in the empire. Dong was 22. The cut-sleeve story is preserved in chapter 93 of the Book of Han, written by Bangu about a century after the events. The two of them, the emperor and Dong, had been napping in the imperial chamber. The emperor needed to get up. Dong was sleeping on his sleeve. The emperor took a knife from a side table and cut the sleeve at the shoulder so he could move without disturbing the man he loved. He walked out of the chamber half-dressed, holding the rest of the sleeve. The official next to him recorded the moment, and, the cut sleeve, entered the language permanently. The court hated this. Not because of the relationship, which was unremarkable in court terms, but because of the speed of Dong Xian's promotion and because the emperor was openly preparing to designate him heir to the throne, which was unprecedented and against every Han succession rule. When Emperor Ai died in August of 1 BC, after only 6 years on the throne, his deathbed wish was that Dong Xian inherit. The Grand Empress Dowager, the same political grandmother who had killed Han Yan a century earlier, did exactly what her predecessor had done. She seized the imperial seal. She stripped Dong Xian of all titles within 24 hours. She allowed him exactly enough time to go home, and that night, Dong Xian and his wife took poison together. He was 23 when he died. The cut sleeve, in other words, is not just a romantic image. It is the image of a relationship at its highest point, recorded by a historian who knew, while he was writing, that the lover holding the sleeve would be dead and disgraced within months of his patron. Chinese poetry has been working with that double meaning for 2 millennia. What Sima Qian wrote down on purpose. The reason we know any of this is that the Han dynasty had a particular kind of historian. Sima Qian, son of the previous court astronomer, took over his father's job around 107 BC and spent most of his life writing the records of the Grand Historian, the first comprehensive narrative history of China. The records have 130 chapters. Most of them are biographies of statesmen, generals, philosophers, and rebels. Chapter 125 is the chapter Sima Qian called The Lives of the Favorites, in which he records, in order, the named male lovers of every previous Han emperor with the gifts they received and the manner of their fall. He is not snide about it, he is not condemning. He treats the subject the way he treats every other subject in the book, which is as if it is an ordinary and worth recording feature of the political life of the dynasty. Sima Qian had been castrated himself in the same court he was writing about, ordered by Emperor Wu, for the political offense of defending a disgraced general. He had as much reason as anyone to be cynical about the men around the throne. He still wrote the chapter as if it were a normal beat in the history of the Han. This is why we have the rest of this video. Most ancient civilizations had institutions like this, and most of those civilizations, for various reasons, did not document them in their official chronicles. The Han did. Ban Gu copied Sima Qian's structure when he wrote the Book of Han. Later dynasties looked at the Han chronicles, decided that this was how official history was supposed to work, and continued to include male favorites in their formal biographical chapters, all the way through to the Ming. The Chinese dynastic histories are, among other things, the longest continuously maintained record of named male same-sex relationships in human civilization. The Tang imports their own version. The Tang dynasty, which ran from 618 to 907 AD, and is generally considered the high point of Chinese cosmopolitan culture, kept the institution but rebranded the language. The Tang court was full of foreign visitors. Sogdians, Persians, Koreans, Arabs, Tibetans, all of them sent embassies that stayed for months at a time. Chinese poetry of the Tang period mentions male favorites less directly than the Han chronicles, partly because the Tang aesthetic preferred coded references to direct ones, and partly because the institution was changing. The major Tang emperors mostly used a different word for what you are, lover, rather than favorite. Multiple Tang emperors had named male partners. The poet Bo Xingjian, brother of the more famous Bai Jui, wrote the poetical essay on the Supreme Joy, around 800 AD, which is the earliest surviving Chinese text that explicitly addresses same-sex love as a topic, and which lists Mizi Xia, Long Yangjun, and Dong Xian as the 3 founding figures of the tradition. The essay is fragmentary today. The complete version was lost sometime in the medieval period. We have it because a copy turned up in the early 20th century inside the library cave at Dunhuang, sealed up around 1000 AD, and not opened again until 1900. Half of what we know about Tang attitudes to your job survived because a monk on the Silk Road bricked a manuscript into a wall. The Ming bans it and practices it anyway. Things change in the Ming dynasty, which runs from 1368 to 1644 AD. The Ming Code, originally drafted under the founder and revised under the Jiajing Emperor in the mid-16th century, formally banned sodomy as a criminal offense for the first time in Chinese imperial law. The penalty was, depending on the era and the magistrate, a flogging or a year in penal servitude. Enforcement was, by every account that survives, almost zero. What this looks like in practice is the moment in the institution's history where the public legal code and the private practice diverge most dramatically. The Zhengde Emperor, who ruled from 1505 to 1521, was famous in his own lifetime for his many male lovers, including, allegedly, the Muslim lord Sayyid Hussein, although modern scholars treat that specific story as politically motivated propaganda. The Wanli Emperor, who reigned from 1572 to 1620, was rumored to keep a private boys' household. The provincial gazettes of Fujian, on the southeast coast, document local marriage-style ceremonies between older and younger men called the Qi Xiang, the contracted brothers, that function as a regional adaptation of your job into a private civilian institution. The 17th century scholar Zhe Zhaozhe, writing in the late Ming, says that this fondness can be found from Jiangnan and Zhejiang in the south to Beijing and Shanxi in the north, and that there is no province that does not know it. So the Ming government bans the practice, and Ming literature documents it openly in every region of the empire. The legal code is a paper screen. Behind the paper screen, the institution is fully operational. The Qing dynasty sends you to the opera. By the High Qing, in the 18th and 19th centuries, the institution has shifted form. It is no longer a court-favored institution. The Qing emperors, who were Manchu and culturally distinct from the Han elite, did not maintain a public favorite class the way the Han had. But the broader urban institution, the one that lived outside the palace, blossomed into something the Han would not have recognized. In Beijing, a particular category of male performer called the Dan, the actor who specialized in playing female roles in the local opera, became the social and sexual centerpiece of upper-class Beijing nightlife. The most famous Dan actors were trained from boyhood, lived in semi-private establishments called Xianggong Tangzi, the houses of the boy companions, located deep in the alleys of the inner city, and offered, alongside their stage performances, a complete escort service to the scholar elite. The training began as early as age 7. The boys were drilled in voice projection, foot-binding style walks, classical poetry, calligraphy, and sometimes the qin, the 7-stringed lute that had been the prestige instrument of Chinese gentlemen for 2,000 years. By 18, a successful Dan could entertain a table of imperial examiners, perform in a Peking opera at midnight, write a respectable poem on demand, and command, for an evening, the price of a senior bureaucrat's monthly salary. By the late 19th century, in fact, male prostitution in Beijing was so dominant that visitors to the city documented difficulty finding female prostitutes in the central pleasure quarters. The Qing Code, which had inherited the Ming sodomy ban, was openly ignored within the imperial city itself. Foreign embassies who came to Beijing in the 1860s wrote home about it in scandalized tones that, when read today, also read as anthropological data points. Your job, in other words, had been converted from a court institution into a commercial one and outsourced to the theater district. The job was running, if anything, hotter than it had ever run. The biographical record from this period is thicker than from any earlier era, because the Qing produced a genre of literary handbook called the Huapu, the Flower Register, which was effectively a published guidebook to the most celebrated Dan actors of a given Beijing season. The Huapu reviewed performances, ranked the boys by beauty and talent, and printed addresses. Most surviving copies are in the rare books collections of Chinese university libraries today, and they read, page for page, like the most genteel possible directory of an industry that everyone knew existed and that almost no public document outside the Huapu acknowledged in print. The end in 1907. The Qing sodomy law was finally repealed in 1907, 4 years before the dynasty itself collapsed in the Republican Revolution. The repeal was part of a broader legal reform driven by Western pressure and the desire of the late Qing court to modernize. By accident of timing, the legal end of the institution as a formal criminal category and the political end of Imperial China came within 4 years of each other. The republic that followed adopted modern criminal codes that were variously silent, hostile, or tolerant depending on the year, and the public institution of the male favorite, which had been a feature of Chinese imperial life from the spring and autumn period to the late Qing, simply lost its setting. That is, perhaps, the key thing. The institution always lived inside imperial courts, palace households, and the urban entertainment districts that orbited them. When the empire ended, the structures that had supported the institution for 2,400 years ended too. The cut sleeve became a vocabulary word. The bitten peach became an antique reference, and the only people who continued to use the language were poets and historians, who knew exactly which dead emperor each phrase quietly cited. What survived is the vocabulary. Your life as a male concubine in Imperial China is, among other things, a long lesson in how a culture remembers its own romantic life. Most pre-modern civilizations had institutions like this. Greece had pederasty. Rome had imperial favorites. Persia had the Aramenos system imported from the Hellenistic East. Most of those vocabularies died with the institutions. China is unusual in that the institution disappeared, but the vocabulary survived. The cut sleeve, the bitten peach, the fashion of long yang, the anling spring. Every educated Chinese reader between roughly 200 BC and the present has been able to read these phrases and know exactly which emperor and which lover the writer is referring to. The footnotes are still in the language. What the institution actually felt like, day to day, for the man on the favored end of it, is harder to recover. The emperors and their officials wrote down the public record. The favorites themselves, almost without exception, did not write memoir. The exception is interesting. There is one Tang-era poetry collection by a man named Xian, possibly the courtesan poet of an imperial household, that survived in fragments and includes verses that read, even at 12 centuries distance, as a clear-eyed report from inside the institution. Most of the rest of the inside view is gone. We have the chariots, the peaches, the cut sleeves, and the names. The interior life of the favorite is mostly missing, recorded only in the negative space around what the historians chose to keep. You die, as most of the famous ones die, either young or in disgrace, or both. Your robe ends up in a wardrobe somewhere, with a hole in it. The hole becomes a phrase. The phrase outlives the dynasty. And 2,000 years later, somewhere in a modern Chinese language textbook, a teenager runs into the words, cut sleeve, for the first time, asks a teacher what they mean, and the teacher tells them about a sleepy afternoon in 1 BC, when an emperor took out a knife, rather than wake the man he loved.